YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, 21st of August.
This morning, Gray Connolly, he's a Sydney barrister who also writes on war, religion, politics, history and law. Osman Faruqi is news and politics editor at junkie.com and co-host of @FactCheckFBI. And Jane Gilmore, freelance writer. Big news, Jane, this week, I think, in politics was the decision to close Manus. Long anticipated, I suspect.
The thing I found most staggering about that was a government minister calling a press conference to say that children were lying about sex abuse while the Royal Commission into Institutionalised Sexual Abuse is still going on. That was one of those moments where you stare at the TV thinking, am I watching the ABC or is this the Comedy Channel? It was absolutely gobsmacking. And he still doesn't seem to even understand that accusing children who are disclosing sexual abuse of lying is a problem. It's entirely about defending himself from any wrongdoing.
And defending government policy as well. Here's Minister Dutton.
I made very clear today, and I'll make it clear again now, that people from Manus Regional Processing Centre will not be settling in Australia, and I've made that clear. The PNG government accepts that, and that's the consistent approach of the government.
It's a test here, isn't it, Gray Connolly, now of, well, resettlement is the thing. Yes, we know that there's been some success in this policy in stopping boats, but we have thousands of people languishing indefinitely. What do we do with them?
Well, I'd take an even broader view, and that is that there are approximately 60 million displaced people in the world, of which 20 million at least are refugees. And I think we are taking too narrow a view of this issue just to focus on Nahru and Manus, because we also have refugees in camps in Africa, in Jordan, in Lebanon and Turkey who are also awaiting resettlement. And many of these have no hope of paying a people smuggler. They have no hope really of getting out of their situation. And I'm in particular thinking of Christian Syrian Iraqis who have lost everything and have nowhere to go. So I think Australia needs to take a broader view of resettlement. I've always been in favour of increasing the refugee intake. I think Australia as a large country and a very wealthy country can always do more. I think the biggest problem we have is that we need to marry up certain objectives that all Australians, I think, would agree on. I think we all want to have a humane resolution. I do not think any of us like indefinite detention, but also none of us want to incentivise people smuggling, and none of us really can contemplate an open borders regime. This is a very complex issue. I do think, as an act of good faith, any Conservative government would do the right thing by increasing our refugee intake, as long as people are properly vetted and we know who they are coming into the country, and that's done very much in camps by the UNHCR and the IOM and places like that. I think there is a very strong case for increasing the refugee intake generally. In terms of the resettlement of the people in Nahru and Manus and the like, I think that can be done on a case-by-case basis by people of goodwill acting in a sensible way. I know that sounds very utopian, but these are people who have lives and they have every right to seek asylum. And I think we as Australians, we have a very rich country. I take the view we're a very good country, a very generous country. And I think we can always do more on this front.
I mean, Osman, that's the thing, isn't it? We have people in both Nahru and Manus who have legitimate claims to asylum. They're refugees. I mean, does it do harm to our policy position to let them into this country?
I don't think it does harm at all. And I think Gray's point about UNHCR processing these people who are languishing in camps, including in Indonesia. There's a report in the Sun Herald today that the cost of running Manus Island since it was opened up 4 years ago has just hit $2 billion. That's $1 million for each of the refugees that we've sent there. That's money that is desperately needed by the UNHCR as it's processing refugees. And I think one of the issues when we take a bit of a broader look at this is some of the reasons, some of the drivers as to why refugees feel the need to get on leaky boats and come to Australia is because the UN is so underfunded that it's not able to process claims quickly enough. So we've got people living in camps around the world, including in Indonesia, for years. But if we could increase our funding and support to the UNHCR so we could process those claims quicker, then we could get genuine refugees to Australia without having to spend billions locking them up in Manus Island and Nauru and them having to experience trauma and abuse for years.
I mean, it's interesting, Jane, how this conversation is beginning to shift. I mean, there was a big column in the Weekend Australian yesterday in a paper not known for its support of open borders. This column describing what we're doing in Nahru and Manus is the modern equivalent of mounting decapitated heads on pikes to ward off enemies. There's a real shift in the rhetoric.
I think there's been a long resistance to people understanding that the asylum seekers are humans like us. There's been a long resistance to the empathy that is almost impossible to hold on to in the face of what we've been seeing in The Guardian, those 2,000 reports, the reports of things that are happening to children. You actually have to be slightly psychopathic to not understand, to not have empathy for abused children. So I think it's almost impossible for people to ignore it now. And also, I think, just from the other side of it, that they're starting to understand the amount of money that we're spending on it, that spending that money on resettling those people in Australia and providing the infrastructure and the services that would be required to help those people become happy contributing citizens of Australia is actually far less than it costs to keep us over there.
It's possible, isn't it, Gray, to have a policy position which accommodates things like turnbacks, but accommodates things like a decent queue, a lifted humanitarian intake. We can walk and chew gum.
Yes, indeed. I agree with you there. I think the one thing that needs to be borne in mind by people is that Australia is a high immigration country. We have a very high legal immigration intake, and for demographic reasons, we're always going to probably need to for the foreseeable future. And any effort to legitimise illegal immigration runs the risk that you'll damage the cause of legal immigration. I think it was John Howard who said that Australians will keep the front door open if they think the back door is shut. And the other issue that I think people need to bear in mind is whatever Australia does with respect to border protection and resettling refugees, and that dreaded phrase of putting sugar on the table, that will affect our interests and relations with other countries. Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Iran particularly, these will all be countries that are affected by anything we do on this front. I think we need to proceed quickly but prudently. I do, though, think something is going to have to be done. It's not in the Australian way, in my view, for us to be operating an indefinite regime of detention of people who really, as a country of immigrants, all our parents, or us, are immigrants. My parents are both immigrants. Most Australians have some recent immigrant or perhaps distant immigrant past. I think it's very important that we bear in mind that all of us are immigrants, well, except, of course, the first Australians, but all of us are immigrants. And most, if not all, people coming here are coming here for a better life and to contribute. And I think we need to focus on that.
Not the Australian way, but certainly the way of our politics in recent years, but perhaps that's beginning to shift. Our outsiders this morning, Gray Connolly, Osman Faruqi and Jane Gilmore. Osman, we're about to kick off another parliamentary session in a week or two, and the talk is pretty tough. We've got an ALP, Osman, which appears to have learnt its lessons in opposition from Tony Abbott. Is that going to make for a constructive parliament?
That's a very good way of putting it. It seems to be that Labor's lessons from the last few years has been act more like Tony Abbott and hope that it all works out for you. But I'm not convinced that it will work. I think what we're seeing from Labor, these threats to deny pairs to the government and cause general havoc in Parliament, that's the sort of stuff that Australians are really fed up with. And I think it's one of the reasons why both the major parties have been in such significant turmoil over the last half a decade. It's why we've seen so many leadership changes, why we keep seeing government switching from one side to another. Australians are sick of politicians playing games, wasting their money, wasting their time, when there are big national issues to grapple with, whether that's refugees, whether it's health funding, whether it's stuff closer to home like education. And I think if the Labor Party think that they're going to cruise back into government by adopting the same crash through brutal approach that Tony Abbott deployed, I think they're kidding themselves. I think what Australians want is a positive, bold vision laid out and politicians treating the public like adults and engaging them in real conversations, not beating each other over the head in Canberra.
Which makes, Jane, I think this first test for the ALP here, I think that's been set by the government, the $6.5 billion omnibus saving bill. I mean, it's money, as the government points out, that Labor has used in its campaign estimates. It's money that's basically is budgeted on. How can it knock that bill back in the Parliament?
Well, I don't really think the ALP is the issue here. I think there's too much dysfunction in the rest of the party. Even if the ALP was being entirely peopled by Tony Windsors, it's still the rest of the Parliament, all the crossbenchers in the Senate with wildly differing agendas and not a lot of people who are willing to listen to a lot of different points of view. I can't see how this Parliament's going to work. And I agree that Labor does need to show some kind of statesman-like qualities if they're going to be taken seriously by the public. But even if they do, the government itself is in such disarray. There's so much disunity in the party. They've got a one-seat majority. They still haven't sorted out what they're going to do with the Speaker, and there is no way they're going to be able to get any legislation through the Senate. I would be really surprised if this government lasts 3 years, honestly.
It sounds like a jolly time, Gray. I mean, does that accord with your expectation?
I tend to have an even stronger view than Osman. I think this whole argument about pairing and the like is exactly what people hate rightly about politics and politicians. Australia has, without doubt, now the worst crop of politicians I think we've probably ever had, certainly in my lifetime. We have over-promoted political hacks. We have former student politicians playing these imbecilic games of interest to no one outside the 2600 postcode. We simply have the worst politicians who are just not fit for purpose. And I do genuinely worry that we are in difficult budgetary times. We are going to need some form of grand bargain, some sort of Australian version of Simpson Bowls, where everyone on all sides of the political fence is going to have to give up something. People on the right are going to have to give up the idea of tax cuts. The country just simply does not raise enough by way of revenue. The left is going to give up something by the way of spending, and particularly welfare. We have too few people working and contributing. We have too many people dependent on the state. We really are going to have some form of grand bargain. To do that, you need mature, prudent, sensible people to argue in good faith about what is and is not essential to their cause, and we need people to come together, and we need it to happen soon. These arguments about pairing and this general hackery is nothing short of a disgrace to all of us who pay the taxes that keeps this country going, to all of us who work for this country, and all of us who love this country. And I think our politicians are, frankly, the worst crop of politicians we've ever had. They deserve the disrespect and contempt that they're held in.
And on that note, sport.
Away in the second semi-final, the men's 100 metres freestyle. Cole Chalmers didn't get the best of the start. He's upstroking quickly to make up the ground. Mignon of France was out quickly. And over on the far side, Condorelli. Chirigini of Brazil in one. He's out very fast. Timmers of Belgium in two. Condorelli of Canada in three. Chalmers is just back from them, but not as far as this morning. Scott from Great Britain in fives right there. They roll through it halfway. Chirigini takes them through. Condorelli's 4/100ths of a second away. Scott's in third. Chalmers is in seventh, so he's got a chase.
He's got a chase, but there was a lot faster than this morning's split, so good swimming here from Chalmers. He's coming through now.
Condorelli has taken the lead from the Brazilian, and the Australian starting to come through. Chalmers, Condorelli to chase. Chalmers is lifting. He's a motor in the final stages. They touch. Chalmers got there again. He is a mighty finisher. From the clouds, Kyle Chalmers in 47.88. He splits Adrian and McAvoy on the timesheets. Condorelli second. Timmers is in third. What we know about this 18-year-old is he's a racer.
Oh, Jane, clearly Kyle Chalmers has been one of the highlights for Australians from Rio, but there were less of them than we might have hoped for.
Look, honestly, what I know about Olympics would fit in a matchbox without taking the matches out. But I do think the amount of money that is spent on that for the comparative benefit is almost obscene. I think there's an argument that if you spend money on Olympics, that people will be inspired and they'll go out and get more exercise, which is a good thing. But I think if you spent that amount of money on making accessible bike parks and community sports available and government-sponsored gym memberships, you'd have a much better effect on getting the Australians up off their arse and moving, which we definitely need to do. And the amount of money that's spent on the Olympics compared to what's spent on the arts, which far more Australians access, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's not logical.
It's an interesting alignment of priorities, Osman, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I think the way that Gray feels about politicians is basically how I feel about our current crop of Olympians. I think Jane's point is right broadly about the amount of money that we're putting in, but I think if we are going to put in, I think it's nearly $400 million over the last 4 years training up athletes to compete in these Olympic Games. We need to have serious conversations about the payoff, and it's our worst, I think, overall medal haul since the Barcelona Games. And there seems to be still quite deep-seated cultural problems within the Olympic team. There's been a number of reports out this week that the swimming team just refuses to integrate with the rest of the Australian Olympic team over there in Rio. And you've got players like Matthew Dellavedova, who earns $10 million a year playing for the US NBA, who's just, getting along well and showing leadership and showing us that Australian spirit that we like to think all of our Olympians are, but the swimmers keep getting into strife and keep thinking that they're, another breed entirely. I think, well, why exactly are we paying for these guys just to go over to Rio to lose and then to party while they're representing Australia? And sorry, that sounds brutal, but if we're paying a lot of money, I want them to win, and I think we need to realise that Australia maybe isn't as good on
one thing is certain, we don't need to think about it for 4 years. Thank you for our outsiders this morning. Gray Connolly, Osman Faruqi, and
Okay, cutting here.